Hello and welcome to the Mile and No-Till Field Day. I'm Dan Grove, the Wildlife Health Specialist for UT Extension, and I also serve as the Wildlife Veterinarian for TWRA. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about chronic wasting disease. That's a big concern for folks here in the state of Tennessee since its discovery in the southwest portion of the state in 2018. And what we'll do is we'll just cover a little bit about what the disease is, where it is in the state, and what we're planning on doing about it in the future. So to start off with, chronic wasting disease is a prion-related disease, and it primarily affects our white-tailed deer and our elk species here in the state of Tennessee, but it also infects elk and mule deer and caribou in the wild and other portions of the United States, Canada, and throughout the world. Primarily here in the United States, it's been found in 26 states and 4 Canadian provinces. It's also been found in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and then it was also moved in the captive cervid industry to South Korea, and that was in elk. At this point in time, Tennessee joins the ranks of many. The disease was first found in Colorado in the late 60s. It was found in a research pen in northern Colorado, and then subsequently in mule deer and elk outside of those pens, and then in the wild in Colorado and Wyoming. Since that point in time, a lot has been learned about the disease, but it wasn't first identified what the cause of the disease was until the early 1980s, whenever they first discovered what prions were. So prions are basically just abnormal proteins. They're not a normal infectious agent like we think of, like viruses or bacteria or parasites or fungus or things like that. They're just an abnormal protein that whenever they get in the body, it causes the normal protein in the body that's the similar protein to it to just misshape. And unfortunately, the body can't use that misshapen protein, and it tends to build up because the body can't break it down either. And so whenever it builds up, that's when we start to see damage. And the primary place where that prion actually occurs is in our neurologic tissue, so in our brain and our spinal cord and places like that. So in deer and elk, what we'll actually start to see to begin with is the animals start to kind of get like a thin, poor hair coat. You know, they'll just kind of be scruffy looking. And it's a little bit different than whenever they actually blown out their hair coat whenever they're changing during seasons. It never comes back in. And then you start to see the animal literally waste away as they stop eating. Towards the end stages, you might see them standing around, unafraid of humans. They'll be drooling. And unfortunately, a lot of the signs that are associated with the disease are similar to many other diseases. So without actually testing the animal, we don't actually know that it has the disease or not. And the real problem with this disease is the animal can be infected and not show clinical signs until upwards of 12 to 18 months post-infection. And so that animal can actually be on the landscape, spreading those prions to other animals, as well as depositing those prions on the landscape. And so ultimately, the longer an animal's out there, the more of these prions that might build up on the landscape. And these things, like I said, they're really hard. The body can't destroy them. And once they get out into the environment, they're really hard to destroy. They're nearly indestructible. So our normal mechanisms of heat and sunlight and freezing and all those things that usually would destroy our viruses and our bacteria and things once they get in the environment, they don't destroy prions. The only things that we found that can actually destroy prions are extremely high heat, and that's above 1800 degrees Fahrenheit, and then through chemical denaturing. So basically high concentrations of really harsh chemicals will actually break those proteins down and make them no longer infectious. Unfortunately, forest fires and things like that, they don't actually burn hot enough to actually destroy the prions. So there's not any mechanisms that we have at this point in time to destroy them once they get in the environment, and they do tend to accumulate in the environment. So that's kind of what we're faced with this disease. It's a chronic insidious type disease. They've actually seen population declines out west in areas where they've had the disease for a long time, and declines upwards of 40% of the population have declined, and they're not showing any signs of recovery at this point in time. So when Tennessee started a new surveillance program in 2018, and it was a surveillance program that was basically based at the county level, and it was designed around finding the disease in an area where it wasn't known to exist before. And essentially what it was a weight-based surveillance scheme. And what that means is that certain animals that we found throughout the United States that have had the disease, and looking at patterns in other states, we know that adult bucks are more likely to have the disease early on whenever the disease first exists in an area. And so they're weighted higher in the scheme. So one buck will be worth the value of like a doe fawn or a doe buck. And so, and then does are ranked in between those two things. And then yearlings are a little bit less. So essentially, each county had a risk assessment made for it as to the presence or absence of the disease. And a lot of things were taken into consideration. The proximity of that county to other areas that have it in the wild. So, Virginia has it, Missouri has it, Arkansas has it. So what's the, proximity of that county to those areas? The deer density in the county, the quality of habitat in the county, all kinds of things factored into it. And so each county had a set of points that had to be met. And so all 95 counties in 2018 had a good sample set. We met our goals in 2018. Unfortunately, we also detected the disease in Fayette and Hardeman County that same year, as well as one positive detection in Madison County. So going into the 2019-2020 season, we actually had 3 positive counties and then an additional 4 counties that we were considering high-risk counties. And those would be counties that were within the geographic border of the county was within 10 miles of a known positive in the wild. And that's kind of how it's designated at this point in time, high-risk and positive counties. At the end of the 2019-2020 season, we actually ended up adding a few more counties to that list. So in total now, Hardeman and Fayette County are positive counties. Shelby County, Tipton County, Haywood County, Madison County, and Chester County are all positive counties. And we have 4 additional counties that are considered high-risk counties. That'd be McNairy County, Lauderdale County, Gibson County, and Crockett County. And so that kind of makes up the area of concern right now for chronic wasting disease in the state. Again, that's based on the sampling efforts. So in total, we've sampled approximately 19,000 animals since the beginning of the 2018 hunting season. And most of that sampling actually occurred this last year. So it was about around 5,300 animals were sampled in 2018 hunting season. In the 2019-20 season, it was roughly 14,000 animals sampled statewide. And of the 14,000 animals that were sampled this year, roughly 12,000 of those came from those initial 8 counties that I mentioned. And majority of those, roughly 4,500 of those actually came from just Fayette and Hardeman County. And so with all those animals tested and all those samples that we've collected, what we found is the disease is here. It's pretty much endemic. It's safe to say that it's endemic at this point in time, which means the disease will just kind of always probably be in those counties specifically. Some of the peripheral counties, there's still some work that we can do to potentially remove the disease from those counties because it's occurring at a much lower prevalence. Prevalence being the number of animals on the landscape that might actually have the disease. And we usually represent that as a percentage. So, a number, whenever we say 10%, that's 10 out of 100 deer, if you were to test them in a given area, would actually have the disease. So that's a 10% prevalence. So we're actually looking at Fayette and Hardeman County, and we're looking at county-wide whenever we report these numbers out at this point. In Fayette County, we're roughly at about 14% prevalence in our overall population, and in Hardeman County, the overall prevalence is roughly 7 to 8%. But the reality is there's about a 500 square mile area right on the Fayette County and Hardeman County border that 60% plus of all of those positive animals that I mentioned came from. And so with all those positives in that one area, that area is probably likely to have a much higher prevalence, because whenever you add in all the animals that were tested from outside that area, it kind of dilutes the prevalence a little bit. So the estimates are actually that the prevalence in that area, in that really refined area along the Fayette County and Hardeman County border, is roughly 35% prevalence overall in that area, which is a really, really high prevalence to first find the disease. And so it kind of puts us where we have kind of 2 areas, where we have a core area and then the outside area, where as you move out from that core area, the prevalence gets lower and lower. So in total, we've detected a roughly 670 positive animals on the landscape out of all those animals that we've tested, which is a lot. To put it in perspective, there's only 2 or 3 other states that have actually detected more in a single year than we detected this year in the state of Tennessee. And those states would be, states like Colorado, Wyoming, and Wisconsin, which are the states that everybody thinks of when they think about chronic wasting disease. So where does that leave us at this point in time? So last year we had altered some of the hunting regulations to encourage folks to hunt more animals, to be able to remove more bucks from the landscape, because we know they tend to have a wider home range and they actually tend to interact with more deer in the landscape. So by removing bucks from the landscape, you can break one aspect of the transmission cycle. In terms of does, once we find a doe in a given area, does have a more discrete home range. And so we know that once we find a large number of does in an area, it's there in that area. It wasn't just a random buck that had wandered in. A doe and her matriarchal unit, basically her female offspring and even her mother, they'll tend to actually stay in the same general area their whole lives and have overlapping home ranges. So the disease will actually spread within those family groups. And so when we talk about it, we think about it, it's just evenly distributed on the landscape, but it's not really. It all has to do with the interaction of other animals on the landscape that might have been positive, where their home range is, and where the potential source might have come. Overall, though, it's kind of going to be an uphill battle, unfortunately, at this point in time for that core area there in Fayette and Hardeman County. In the periphery, there's a lot that we can actually still do, and TWRA is working on some management programs that make it easier for landowners to remove animals from their property, as well as programs to be able to encourage people to come in and hunt and remove animals. And that's what it comes down to at this point in time, because we don't have any environmental solutions for these areas that have had the disease on the landscape for quite some time. There's probably a high level of prion in the environment which acts to infect animals. And so there's not a way to treat the environment at this point in time, which is one of the areas that we need to do a lot more research on. So one of the things that we actually get asked a lot, we know we have a bad problem here in the state of Tennessee, is what will the future look like here in Tennessee? And the reality is we don't know yet. But if we look to other places, I mentioned declines earlier in some of the states out west, as well as, potentially other areas that have had the disease for a while. But what we have learned, if we look at other states that have the infection in white-tailed deer like we do here, so you looked at Wisconsin, and one of the things that Wisconsin's actually seen is they've actually seen not necessarily a population decline at this point in time, but they've actually seen a shift in the age structure. So when you have good quality habitat like we have here in Tennessee and a good population density, we're estimates of anywhere from 75 to 100 deer per square mile in Fayette and Hardeman County, depending on where you're at. So in those kind of conditions, the disease can actually plug and chug along until you reach a high enough prevalence to where it's starting to show impacts. So some of those impacts that you might actually see is a shift in age structure. Well, what does that mean? So you don't see older animals on the landscape anymore because they get infected at a young age. And if you die within 12 to 18 months of being infected, you might only be on the landscape for at most 2 to 3 years. And so you actually see a downward shift in the upper end of the adult animals that are on the landscape. You also start to see poor fawn recruitment, because if a doe dies and the fawn isn't completely raised up at that point in time, the fawn's not likely to survive. It's more likely to be preyed upon, it's more likely to be harvested through hunter harvest, and just more likely just to die of natural causes out there, as well as potentially succumb to the disease itself. And so these are some of the negative impacts that we'll actually see. And we probably already are experiencing in that little area that I mentioned, that 500 square mile area around the Fayette and Hardeman County border. But it's really hard to detect that without a long-term data set. And so we're really only 2 collection seasons into collecting data on chronic wasting disease in Tennessee. And so really, it's going to take about 5 years worth of data to actually be able to pick up on some of those patterns. But unfortunately, one of the things that we actually did discover this year is that there has been a statistically significant increase in the prevalence in Fayette and Hardeman counties. What does that mean? that means that it's not just because we tested more animals. That's an actual real increase in the prevalence of the disease on the landscape. And so, we have a good even distribution of samples across the landscape. So one of the things that we are encouraging people to do is to report the location of your harvest this year if you're harvesting in those counties, so that we can get a better idea of the finer scale details of the prevalence rates on the landscape. We have all the locations of the positives, and that gives us a lot of information as to the geographic spread. But in terms of getting non-detect locations, we didn't get enough non-detect. So basically, if your animal came back as non-detected, we didn't get enough of those locations to actually narrow in and figure out what the true prevalence is in different areas of the different counties. And so that's why we report things out on a county-wide basis. So that information is one thing that you guys can help with providing us, as well as continuing to keep hunting. So a question we get asked a lot, we're encouraging everyone to keep hunting. What happens if I eat meat from this animal? The first thing is if you do harvest a positive animal, we don't recommend that you consume meat from that animal, because the jury really is still out on whether or not you can become infected from eating meat from deer that are known to be positive from the disease. But with that being said, the disease has been on the landscape for a long time out west and other parts of the country, and a lot of people have knowingly and unknowingly consumed meat from infected animals, and there's never been a link between eating meat from an infected deer and human disease. But the CDC recommends that you take caution, because there are other diseases that are in the prion group of infectious agents, such as mad cow disease, that you can get. And so, since there hasn't been a one study that says one way or the other, there's been a lot of conflicting studies, we just urge caution. And so we want to provide you with the information so that you can make the best decision for yourself, but we don't encourage you to eat the meat if it is positive. We would prefer that you dispose of that meat. And there's plenty of opportunities to harvest another animal at this point in time. And so one of the other things that we recommend, if you're harvesting the animal and processing it yourself, go ahead and just butcher that out and quarter it and freeze it until you get your results back. We've done a lot to try and decrease the turnaround on testing this year. But again, it's a hit or miss sometimes, unfortunately, because we are working with labs that are not right where we're getting the samples. And so there is some just natural delay that occurs. But we've done everything we can to decrease the turnaround time this year, and hopefully we get those results back to you so you can make an informed decision about whether or not to consume your animal. So at this point in time, we don't have all the regulations set at the time of the filming of this video, but by the time you see this video, the regulations will be set. I encourage you to visit the TWRA website for more information about the disease, as well as for more information about the hunting regulations and some of the recommendations that are available out there for you as a hunter if you are hunting in an area that's known to have CWD, as well as if you're hunting, even if you're anywhere hunting in the state, how you can actually get your animal tested if you are concerned about having harvested an animal that was positive for the disease. With that, I would like to thank you for your time, and I appreciate you joining us today. And like I said, I encourage you to visit the websites that hopefully are on your screen at this point in time, and we'll see you later.